Tonight's quiet gathering was never about harmony. It was about the truth of a year of stolen trust, walking in uninvited, asking us to breathe, listen, and decide what kind of family we would be. A voice reached this room before the footsteps did, steady, practiced, already shaping the night. I'm Alma. I teach gentle strength. Raphael glanced at me, then toward the threshold that isn't pictured, as if permission were something that traveled on air. Sophia folded her hands on this table. Carlos nodded once. Elena leaned back, and Mateo kept his eyes on me, waiting for my cue. We had rehearsed nothing, yet everyone understood that silence can be choreography. I invited the visitor to sit, not with flourishes, only an open palm toward this chair. They smiled like someone entering familiar territory, and yet the room knew different, because truth changes humidity. Raphael attempted small words that bumped into one another, platitudes searching for purchase. The visitor thanked us, taking their place across from Raphael, careful, composed, measuring the temperature of our patience. I kept my breath long, my tone light, and my posture easy, because gentleness is never the same as surrender. Everyone waited, and I chose the first question carefully. "Thank you for coming," I began, and the visitor inclined their head as though accepting a verdict. "We keep our conversations inside this room," I added, "because walls remember and help us finish what courage starts." Raphael said it would be simple, a quick hello, respectful, and we let that description float without agreeing to it. Sophia asked nothing, yet her stillness steadied the air. Mateo shifted once, settling into patience that looked like granite polished for ceremony. Carlos and Elena anchored corners, turning an ordinary evening into a circle that could hold anything. The visitor was an old colleague of Raphael, and I had learned their connection strayed beyond harmless history into an affair. I nodded, inviting completion, and the next lines arrived, dressed in kindness, glossed with disclaimers, unwilling to name harm. Raphael echoed the visitor, brave for a moment, then less brave, then quiet, because truth is heavier than charm. I thanked them both and promised we would keep the tone warm while we told the whole thing straight. While they adjusted their posture at this table, I adjusted memory, pulling forward the week when quiet patterns began to contradict themselves. Raphael's stories grew symmetrical, too polished, arriving with the same phrases, the same pauses, the same tidy conclusions. I noticed absences shaped like presence, laughter borrowed from somewhere else, a softness he saved for another audience. There is nothing mystical about noticing. It is arithmetic done by the heart. I wrote nothing down that night, but I kept the ledger in breath and spine. Days layered into weeks, and the outline sharpened until the picture stopped arguing with me. The visitor's name reappeared in our orbit, introduced as harmless history. The word harmless doing far too much work. I listened, I smiled, and I practiced calm, because calm is a blade when sharpened for truth. Across this table now, I could see them recognize the patience that had preceded tonight. Patience is not passivity, I thought. It is simply strength that refuses to be hurried. When certainty arrived, it arrived without shouting, a quiet yes that freed me from doubt's theater. I chose conversation over spectacle and asked a simple question of someone far from our household who nevertheless stood inside consequences. They deserved unvarnished daylight, so I offered it, refusing both cruelty and euphemism. The reply did not explode. It breathed, hurt, paused, then asked for proof of what breathing already knew. We spoke in even tones, trading facts, protecting dignity, agreeing that harm multiplies when secrets are allowed to bloom. Together we set tonight's hour, not to perform, but to end fog. Meanwhile, I sat with Raphael in this room, practicing evenings that kept my spirit from burning before the work was done. Sophia saw the change in my posture. Mateo did. Elena and Carlos read it in the space between my sentences. No one pressed, yet everyone steadied me with their quiet, turning this table into a promise. So the visitor arrived, and the story began to tell itself, as stories do when patience opens the window. I placed both palms lightly on this table, a gesture of welcome and a boundary in the same breath. Let's keep to kindness and facts, I said, because both are possible when everyone is brave. The visitor agreed immediately, which told me agreement had long been practiced in other rooms. Raphael searched my face, finding only the steadiness I had brought with me. I asked how their renewed friendship began, and the timeline unfolded, clean as a ribbon, too perfectly kept. Dates aligned with Raphael's tidy stories, and the coincidences seemed intent on auditioning as patterns. I didn't hurry the telling. Patience lets truth show its own handwriting. Sophia asked one question about respect, soft but precise, and silence did the rest. Mateo added a single sentence about family gravity, how honesty keeps us in orbit without burning. Carlos and Elena affirmed that we remain compassionate here, even when the compass points directly at the wound. Across from them, the visitor's smile held, but the edges curled, the way paper does when heat reaches it. I glanced toward the ordinary hallway we won't show, not as dramatics, but as acknowledgement that the evening had one more chapter. We would pause soon, I said, to make space for another voice who deserved a seat at this table. The visitor's throat tightened so gently, it might have been nothing. Raphael's hands opened and closed like undecided doors. Kindness, I repeated, is not confusion, and facts are not cruelty. I asked again about beginnings, this time about promises made back then and reissued lately without their original context. We talked of hope mishandled, grief misread, comfort stolen from the very person it should have cradled. No one raised a voice. Our discipline made the room the bravest person present. Sophia breathed like a metronome. Mateo kept count, ensuring we neither rushed nor stalled. Elena's gaze held Raphael with compassion that never blinked, and Carlos let every answer land before weighing it. Then I said we would hear from someone else, and the room agreed by simply not moving. I asked a trusted witness to join us, the person who, through no fault of their own, held the final piece of this puzzle. Raphael and the visitor stiffened at once. The witness looked only at the visitor, and something fragile between them admitted the date openly. Raphael's inhale sounded like a page turning the wrong direction. "Please sit," I said, letting the chair hold the weight that names were about to drop. We kept titles out of it and used ordinary words: respect, promise, boundary, kindness, and truth. The new voice spoke of calendar lines and future plans presented as if unshared, and we let silence underline every verb. The visitor's explanation kept changing clothes, but the size of it stayed the same. Raphael watched each exchange as though the mirror had learned a new language without him. Sophia's calm steadied the corners. Mateo's calm steadied Raphael. I asked for honesty one more time, and the air felt lighter, because even pain reduces once it stands up and says its name. The newcomer nodded, and truth began walking instead of limping. I told them there was one date I would never blur, the day grief and betrayal shook the same hour. While my body was pleading for mercy, Raphael's tenderness traveled elsewhere, and that arithmetic can never be mistaken for love. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The visitor closed their eyes as if darkness might be kinder than looking at what was already in the light. Raphael whispered about mistakes, then about confusion, then about pain, stacking words like cushions under a stone. I answered that sorrow is not a permit and loneliness is not a passport. Kindness, I repeated, lives here, but so does consequence. Sophia reached for my hand and rested it, steady as rain that chooses not to fall. Matteo named the harm plainly, one sentence, no embroidery, so everyone could hear the measurement. The second voice nodded slowly, accepting the map for what it was, not what they wished it to be. In that acceptance, the room exhaled, and the next step became visible. I placed a quiet decision on this table, not a threat, just clear words arranged in a future I had already chosen. Raphael read the shape of it in my face and understood it was not rehearsal. Our life would turn, I said, and the turning would be honest and lawful and calm. He asked for time. I answered that time had already been lavish and that clarity would be kinder now. Sophia reminded him that family can remain family without pretending, and Elena echoed that healing prefers clean edges. Carlos spoke of accountability as an act of love, not punishment. Matteo breathed, and the breathing steadied us all. Across from us, the visitor tried an apology that sounded like a borrowed speech. I received it because refusing to receive does not build anything, and I declined its invitation to rewrite the past. The second voice thanked me for the light, voice shaking, and said they were done carrying a narrative that cut them. The room agreed in silence. Raphael stood, then sat, then steadied, finally choosing to listen all the way to the end. He apologized without ornament, and I acknowledged the words without mistaking them for repair. We agreed he would step back from our daily rhythm while we arranged the new shape with care. I said we would use precise channels for every necessary detail. Gentle, documented, clean. He nodded, grateful and grieving, and I felt both too, because endings can be honest and still hurt. Sophia offered him a simple blessing, and Elena added one more, because mercy costs very little and prevents interest. Carlos promised to help with logistics, the practical kindness that keeps families from tearing further. Matteo walked him to the hallway with a look that meant dignity only. When the air settled again, the visitor and the second voice thanked us separately, and the evening relinquished its heat. I poured the silence into my lungs and let the room graft new strength onto old bones. Gentleness remained, and so did the boundary it guarded. After the doorless exit, the room felt larger, not emptier, as if honesty had pushed the walls back an inch. Sophia stayed beside me, and we shared a silence that thanked us both for choosing the difficult path. Elena gathered nothing, because there was nothing to gather except breath. Carlos checked that everyone had eaten enough courage. He always measures that supply first. Matteo sat across from me, hands folded like a promise that doesn't need signatures. I told them I was steady, not unhurt, and they believed me because steadiness isn't performance. We spoke of next steps, small and practical, so the heart could rest while the calendar worked. Sophia offered to visit tomorrow, bringing exactly the right amount of laughter and quiet. I said yes, and the room agreed with a sigh that sounded like relief learning to sing again. When they left, I stayed a moment longer, hands flat on this table, memorizing how resolved feels in the body. Gentle strength had a pulse I could finally hear. Morning returned to this room like a teacher, setting out simple tasks that would make the long work possible. I arranged clear plans, notified the right offices, and chose language that neither exaggerated nor minimized what happened. Kindness guided each call I made, but kindness no longer meant pretending. I moved a chair, not for drama, only to see the light fall differently while I thought. Sophia visited and told me jokes that fixed nothing and helped everything. Matteo checked on Raphael with decency, because compassion keeps us human even when we draw lines. Elena and Carlos coordinated schedules like orchestra conductors, ensuring no one carried more weight than they should. I ate, I slept, I walked the room's perimeter like a tiny pilgrimage, returning each lap with a little more air. I wrote down new routines on a plain sheet because order soothes a thundered heart. When night arrived again, the room felt like a friend who had agreed to stay a while. I let gratitude practice beside resolve. A few weeks later, word reached this room from a stranger who was nearly trapped inside the same story. She had met Raphael newly and discovered the truth because our records were clear and our choices public. Her message held relief and anger in equal measure, and I recognized the cocktail immediately. I wished her steadiness, and she wished me peace. Sometimes women trade these like recipes because both are nourishment. Hearing from her did not reopen wounds. It confirmed that telling the truth prevents future harm. Sophia called afterward and said, "You saved someone," and I let myself believe it for a minute. Elena said healing includes neighbors we'll never meet, and Carlos agreed. Mateo added, "Keep going," and somehow that felt like a benediction. I looked around this room and thanked its patience because these walls had held more courage than any courtroom. Gentle strength, I reminded myself, means protecting boundaries without inventing enemies. The room seemed to nod, and I returned to breathing on purpose. Some consequences traveled farther than our lives and landed where standards are sworn aloud. People who hold themselves out as guides must guard trust with fierce humility, and when they don't, communities act. I documented what I could without spectacle, delivered it through the proper channels, and stepped aside. The process was sober, slow, careful, and human, as it should be. Eventually, an answer returned that matched the weight of what happened, a pause, a reckoning, a requirement to relearn the oath. I did not celebrate. I slept. Sophia said accountability is not revenge, and I believed her. Carlos reminded me that boundaries teach, and Elena added that compassion can still include hard fences. Mateo asked whether I felt lighter, and I said not lighter exactly, but clearer. The room kept listening, unhurried, as if understanding that restoration does not enjoy applause. I opened a window in my mind instead, letting air move through the cluttered places because relief often arrives as clarity rather than fireworks or grand declarations. Work became a raft made from this table, its surface turning into a map of what I could still make. I sketched schedules, wrote letters, refined projects, and let momentum rehabilitate my attention. Sophia offered an introduction that grew into steady contracts and kinder timelines. Carlos sent reminders to drink water. Elena dropped by to review invoices. Mateo proofread with the focus of a lens. Raphael fulfilled his agreements from a distance, and I chose informed courtesy. On heavy days, I counted the breaths it took to cross the room and back. On light days, I forgot to count, smiling without asking permission from the past. Gentleness stayed in my voice, but it learned to travel with better armor. I made space on the table for a small stack of hopeful plans, and kept the stack modest by choice. Each evening I closed the imaginary ledger with a hand that no longer shook. The room approved, holding my progress like a lantern that brightened without smoking the ceiling. Eventually the other voice returned, not as a storm, but as a traveler carrying updates. We met in a neutral space of words and traded lessons instead of laments. They said the shock had cooled into purpose, and I recognized the temperature. We agreed that vengeance is a poor architect, but consequences keep dangerous structures from being rebuilt. We did not rehearse the past. We verified it like people signing a final line. I wished them gentleness. They wished me rest. and we promised to leave each other's names out of future chapters. Back in this room, I repeated our pledge to the ceiling, because ceilings hear more than we admit. Sophia laughed when I told her and said, "Look at you, setting good laws." Mateo said, "Wisdom shows up late and still earns the full day's wages." I smiled, finally believing that steady doesn't mean small. Elena added that mercy and memory can share a room if the furniture is arranged with intention and boundaries. One evening, I slid a blank page toward me and began writing a clear account for myself, not for spectacle, not for profit, but to line up the months and harvest the meaning. Each paragraph returned dignity to a moment that had been interrupted by someone else's hunger. I kept names minimal and principles large, so the story could help without scorching. Sophia read a page and cried once, then smiled twice, which felt like a liturgy. Mateo suggested an ending that faced forward, not down, and I took his advice. Elena said to include the chapter about how the room taught me discipline, so I did. Carlos looked at the stack and said, "This is the handbook we needed when harm first knocked." I did not hurry, yet the pages multiplied the way good habits do. When I finished a draft, I slept the whole night like someone whose lungs had been properly introduced to air. The room glowed with a quiet I trusted. A small circle read the account, and their replies arrived like candles, steady instead of spectacular. Some said they felt seen, some said they felt warned, all said they felt invited to choose clarity sooner. I agreed to wider sharing only after removing anything that felt like theater. The story traveled farther than I expected, teaching places I will never go. Raphael sent one message through the official path, acknowledging the fairness of our arrangements and wishing me peace. I replied through the same path with gratitude, boundaries intact. Sophia asked whether I would speak to a group someday, and I said maybe, if the room could come with me. Elena laughed and said the room already lives in my voice. Carlos agreed and suggested I name the talk Gentle Strength, and we all smiled. Mateo said the title had always been true. I had just finally believed it. The room seemed to approve, its silence brighter than applause and kinder than any standing ovation. Seasons turned, and this room kept teaching me where to place my feet. I learned that forgiveness is a garden with many gates, and I may open some and not others. I learned that trust can be rebuilt, but not with the same lumber. We use better wood or we live elsewhere. I learned that anger can be a ferry, useful for crossing, unfit for residence. Sophia's laughter returned first, Elena's counsel second, Carlos's steady questions third, Mateo's quiet last, like a seal on a letter. Raphael changed directions without requiring my permission, which is as it should be now. Our family became wider without breaking, and I am proud of that geometry. At this table, I set out small goals, small meals of courage, and I stayed fed. When the past knocks now, I answer with clarity and send it on its way. Gentle strength remains the anthem, not because I never bend, but because I choose where and why. The room hums along, proof that steady is powerful. Tonight we gather again, the same room, the same table, a different weather entirely. Sophia tells a story, Mateo adds a line, Carlos laughs, Elena offers a question that opens applause. Raphael is elsewhere, walking his chosen path, and I wish him enough light to see it clearly. We honor what ended without letting it define what remains. I do not pretend everything is easy, but I now know where to stand when it is hard. Gentleness is still my first language. Boundaries are my grammar. Courage is the rhythm I keep. I raise no glasses, make no toasts. I simply breathe and let gratitude sit beside me. The visitor's chapter is closed. The second voice's chapter is healing. Our chapter turns a bright page. In this room, I learned that strength can arrive without noise and leave the furniture exactly where it was. And in this room, I continue, choosing steady over spectacle, and choosing a future that tells the truth kindly. Gentle strength carries us forward together.